Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching, whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The rope burned Kyle's small hands as he pulled with everything his 12-year-old body could give. Below him in the ravine, two massive women hung suspended over jagged rocks, their Apache war paint streaking with sweat and dust. The older one, her face carved with scars and wisdom, locked eyes with him through the fading light. She wasn't pleading, she was measuring him, deciding if this white boy yanking on a fraying rope was worth the breath it would take to thank him. The younger sister thrashed against the cliff face, her warrior braids whipping in the desert wind that screamed through Devil's Cut like a wounded animal. Cale's feet slipped in the gravel, his muscles screamed. The rope was cutting into his palms now, drawing blood that mixed with the red dust coating everything in this godforsaken corner of Arizona territory. He should let go. Everyone in Dust Creek would tell him to let go. These were Apache warriors, women who could snap him like a twig if they wanted to, but Cale had been broken before. He knew what it felt like when nobody pulled you back up. 6 months ago, his father had died in a mine collapse while the foreman counted profits. 3 months ago, his mother had worked herself to death washing clothes for the same men who'd buried his father in an unmarked grave. Now he lived in the stable behind the mercantile, sleeping on hay, eating scraps, invisible to everyone except when they needed someone to blame for a missing coin or a spilled barrel. The stable owner, Gideon Rourke, beat him twice a week just for existing. The banker's son, Wesley Finch, threw rocks at him for entertainment. The preacher's wife crossed the street when she saw him coming, like poverty was catching. So, when Cale had stumbled upon these two warriors trapped in a white man's hunting snare meant for elk, something inside him made a decision his brain didn't even register. He'd grabbed the rope. He'd started pulling. Now he was past the point of stopping. The older sister barked something in Apache. Her voice was thunder and stone. She twisted her body, finding a foothold Kyle hadn't seen, taking some of her weight off the rope. The younger one followed her sister's movement, and suddenly Cale wasn't holding 200 pounds of dead weight. He was part of a team. They climbed. He pulled. His shoulders felt like they were tearing from their sockets, but he leaned back, digging his heels into the canyon rim, using his body as an anchor. The rope groaned. Time stretched into something thick and endless. His vision blurred at the edges. Then a hand, massive, scarred, and strong as iron, slammed onto the ledge beside him. The older sister hauled herself up with the kind of strength that made Cale's efforts look like a child's game. She rolled onto flat ground, chest heaving, and immediately reached back for her sister. Together, they pulled the younger woman to safety. Kyle collapsed backward, gasping, his hands leaving bloody prints on his torn shirt. The sky above was turning that particular shade of purple that meant night was coming fast. The two Apache women stood over him, breathing hard, studying him like he was a puzzle written in a language they were just learning to read. Up close, they were even more imposing. The older one stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could carry a buffalo. Her sister was maybe 6'3", younger by perhaps 5 years, with eyes that burned with barely contained fury. They wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with scavenged cavalry pieces, a contradiction that told a story Cale couldn't fully read. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched so long, Kyle wondered if he should run. Then the older sister did something that stopped his heart. She reached down, grabbed his bleeding hand, and pressed it against her chest where her heart thundered like war drums. One word, that's all she said, but it carried the weight of mountains. Nizoni! Then they were gone, melting into the canyon shadows like smoke, leaving Cale alone with the approaching darkness, and a single thought that terrified him more than anything else that had happened today. What had he just done? In Dust Creek, saving an Apache was worse than stealing. It was worse than murder. It was betrayal of everything the settlement stood for, every grudge it held, every fear it nursed like a poisonous pet. And somehow, some way, someone would find out. They always did. Kyle pressed his bleeding palms against his chest, feeling his own heart race with an emotion he couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite pride, something wild and new and dangerous. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of drums from the Apache lands beyond the canyon. Tomorrow was coming, and tomorrow Kyle's life would never be the same. 3 years before that rope burned his hands, Kyle had been somebody. His father, Marcus Webb, had been the best explosives man in 3 territories, respected even by the mine owners who usually treated workers like replaceable tools. Their cabin sat on the edge of Dust Creek, small but solid, with a garden his mother kept that produced vegetables even in the brutal Arizona heat. Kyle remembered coming home from the schoolhouse to find his father teaching him how to read the rock face, how to see the story stone told if you knew how to listen. His mother, Lorelei, sang while she cooked, her voice carrying through the open windows like a promise that everything would stay good forever. Then came the day that divided his life into before and after. The Silver Peak mine had been pushing deeper, ignoring the warnings Marcus gave about unstable shafts and rotten support timbers. The foreman wanted copper, and he wanted it fast, and men like Marcus who counseled caution were obstacles to profit. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning in June. Cale was supposed to be in school, but he'd stayed home with a fever, lying on his cot while his mother pressed cool cloths to his forehead. They heard the boom echo across the valley like God clearing his throat. His mother's face went white as chalk. She ran, and Cale ran after her despite his weakness, both of them racing toward the mine, along with every other woman and child in Dust Creek. By the time they arrived, the entrance was collapsed, sealed with tons of rock and twisted metal. 16 men were inside. The foreman, Chester Rollins, stood there with his arms crossed, already calculating losses and liabilities, his face showing about as much emotion as the rocks that had just murdered those men. They dug for 3 days. When they finally broke through, they found 12 bodies. Marcus Webb was one of them. 4 men had survived, trapped in an air pocket, and they told a story that made Cale's mother weep with rage. Marcus had seen the collapse coming. He'd ordered the men to retreat, had stayed behind to set emergency supports that might give them time to escape. He'd saved those 4 lives by sacrificing his own. The mine company gave the widows $20 each and a warning that they'd contest any legal claims. Kyle's mother took that $20, buried her husband in a pine box on the hill behind their cabin, and went to work washing clothes for the very families whose fathers and husbands had lived because of Marcus's courage. She worked dawn to dusk, her hands raw and bleeding from lye soap and scalding water. Kyle tried to help, taking odd jobs, but at 9 years old, there wasn't much anyone would trust him with. He hauled water, swept floors, mucked stables, and brought home pennies while his mother's health spiraled downward like water disappearing into desert sand. The cough started small, just a tickle she'd dismiss with a wave. Then it grew teeth. By winter, she was coughing up blood into handkerchiefs she tried to hide from Kyle. The doctor said consumption, said mountain air might help, said lots of things that all cost money they didn't have. Kyle watched his mother fade like a photograph left in sunlight, her voice getting softer, her body getting smaller, until one morning in March she simply didn't wake up. He was 11 years old and completely alone. The cabin was seized for unpaid debts. The garden his mother had loved was plowed under by the new owners before her body was even cold in the ground. Kyle found himself on the street with one change of clothes, his father's pocket watch, and a hatred for Dust Creek that burned hotter than the Arizona sun. Gideon Rourke, who owned the Mercantile and the stable behind it, offered him a place to sleep in exchange for work. Kyle thought it was charity until the first time Gideon's belt came down across his back for not stacking crates fast enough. The work was 16-hour days of brutal labor. The place to sleep was a corner of the stable where horse manure was his pillow and rats were his roommates. School became impossible. The other children treated him like he carried plague, their parents having taught them that poverty was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. Wesley Finch, the banker's son, with his pressed suits and gleaming boots, made it his personal mission to remind Cale daily of his worthlessness. He'd trip Cale in the street, throw food at him during the rare times Cale attempted to attend church, spread rumors that Cale was stealing. The sheriff, Wesley's uncle, always believed the banker's son over the orphaned stable boy. Cale learned to make himself small, invisible, to endure rather than fight back, because fighting back meant beatings or jail or both. He learned that in Dust Creek, some people were worth protecting and others were worth nothing at all. He learned that nobody pulls you back from the edge. Nobody saves you when you're falling. So when he saw those two Apache warriors hanging in that ravine, trapped and helpless and about to die, maybe he didn't see enemies of Dust Creek. Maybe he saw himself reflected in their eyes, people the world had decided weren't worth saving, and maybe that's why his hands grabbed that rope before his brain could tell him all the reasons letting go made more sense. Dawn broke over Dust Creek like a promise nobody intended to keep. Cale woke in his corner of the stable with dried blood crusted on his palms and a bone-deep exhaustion that made even breathing feel like work. His hands throbbed where the rope had carved its story into his flesh, red and angry wounds that would scar. He tried to flex his fingers and gasped at the pain. Outside, the town was stirring. Roosters crowing, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against iron, the smell of breakfast fires mixing with manure and dust in that particular perfume that defined frontier life. Cale wrapped his hands in strips of cloth torn from his already threadbare shirt, hiding the evidence of yesterday's choice. He had no illusions about what would happen if someone discovered what he'd done. Dust Creek had been at war with the Apache for 15 years, ever since settlers pushed into lands that weren't theirs and called it progress. Every family had a story of loss, a grave on a hill, a reason to hate. Saving two Apache warriors wouldn't be seen as mercy. It would be seen as treason. Gideon Rourke kicked open the stable door at precisely 6, same as every morning, his face already twisted with the kind of anger that some men wear like a second skin. He was a thick man, not tall but wide, with hands like slabs of meat, and a disposition that suggested life had disappointed him, and he'd decided to spread that disappointment around. "You awake, boy?" he barked, his voice cutting through the morning peace like a dull saw through green wood. Kyle scrambled to his feet, ignoring the protest from his shoulders and back, every muscle screaming from yesterday's rope work. "Yes, sir." The title always tasted like ashes, but survival required swallowing pride. So often Cale barely remembered what pride felt like. Gideon's eyes narrowed, taking in Cale's wrapped hands, the exhaustion written across his face. "What happened to you?" Cale's mind raced. "Tangled with some wire out back, fixing the fence like you asked." The lie came smooth, because lies were another survival skill Cale had mastered. Gideon grunted, apparently satisfied, or more likely, just not interested enough to dig deeper. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of humiliation and exhaustion. Kyle mucked stalls, hauled water from the well, carried 100-pound feed sacks that weighed nearly as much as he did, his wounded hands making every task an exercise in silent agony. Around noon, a commotion in the street pulled him from his work. Through the stable's open door, he could see a crowd gathering in front of the sheriff's office, and his stomach dropped like a stone in deep water. Had someone seen him at the canyon? Had the Apache sisters been tracked back to that hunting snare? His mind spun through possibilities, each worse than the last. But when he crept close enough to hear, the conversation wasn't about him at all. It was about the Apache, but in a way that made his blood run cold. 3 hunting parties hit last week, Sheriff Dalton was saying, his voice carrying that mix of authority and barely controlled rage that lawmen cultivated like a crop. Traps destroyed, game scattered, and one of Morrison's boys found tied to a tree, alive but scared white. Wesley Finch stood at the front of the crowd in his expensive clothes, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. "My father says we should form a militia, push into their territory, show them we won't be pushed around in our own land." The irony of calling it our land wasn't lost on Cale, but he kept his face carefully neutral. Several men nodded agreement, hands already drifting to the guns at their hips. that peculiar eagerness that comes when violence is given permission to dress up as justice. "It's not that simple," came a voice from the back, and Cale was surprised to see Thomas Bridger, an old trapper who'd lived in these territories longer than the town had existed. He was ancient by frontier standards, maybe 70, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen enough to make him cautious where others were reckless. "The Apache have been quiet for months. Something's changed. Could be they're just protecting their own." The crowd didn't like that. Protecting their own sounded too human, too reasonable, and reason was harder to kill than savages. Before the argument could escalate further, a sound cut through the morning air that made every conversation stop. Mid-word, drums, not the distant thunder Cale had heard last night, but closer, deliberate, coming from the eastern edge of town where Dust Creek's scattered buildings gave way to scrubland and canyon country. Every head turned, every hand found a weapon. The drums spoke in a rhythm that felt ancient, purposeful, like a message being delivered in a language older than English or Spanish, older than borders or deeds or the concept of ownership itself. Sheriff Dalton's face went hard as granite. "Everyone stay calm. Nobody fires unless I give the word." But calm was the last thing anyone felt. Cale could see it in their faces, the fear, the hatred, the excitement that comes when an enemy gives you an excuse to do what you've been wanting to do anyway. The crowd moved as one organism toward the sound, and Cale followed, unable to stop himself, drawn by a terrible certainty that whatever was coming had everything to do with what he'd done yesterday. They reached the edge of town where the last building, the church with its whitewashed walls and crooked cross, stood like a declaration of civilization's reach. Beyond it, the land opened into rocky soil dotted with sage and cholas, and there, maybe 100 yards away, standing in a line that seemed to materialize from the heat, shimmer itself, were Apache warriors, 20 of them, maybe more. It was hard to count because they stood so still they seemed part of the landscape, like rocks that had suddenly decided to grow arms and legs. At the center of the line, mounted on a paint horse that stood completely motionless despite having no visible reins or bridle, sat a man who could only be the chief. He was older, maybe 50, with silver threading through his long hair, and a face that looked carved from the same stone as the canyons themselves. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with symbols Cale couldn't read, and across his lap rested a rifle that looked well-maintained and completely capable of erasing the careful distance between the two groups. The drums stopped. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the beating had been. Then the chief did something that made every gun in Dust Creek rise to shoulders. He raised his hand, pointed directly into the crowd, and when Carl followed that finger, his heart stopped. The chief was pointing at him. Time crystallized into something hard and terrible. Every person in that crowd turned to look at Carl, their faces cycling through confusion, suspicion, and dawning anger so fast it was like watching a storm form in seconds. Wesley Finch's mouth fell open, then curled into something ugly. Sheriff Dalton's hand moved to his pistol. Gideon Rourke's face went red as a forge. Cale wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the ground, wanted to be anywhere but standing here with 20 Apache warriors staring at him and his entire town ready to tear him apart. The chief spoke, his voice carrying across the distance with startling clarity, words in Apache that meant nothing to Cale, but everything to Thomas Bridger, who stood near enough to hear the old trapper's sharp intake of breath. "He says," Thomas translated, his voice shaking slightly, "that one among us has shown courage that shames warriors. He says one among us saved his daughters from a white man's trap. He says he has come to honor this debt." The crowd's confusion sharpened into understanding, and that understanding became rage faster than lightning finds ground. "You," Sheriff Dalton grabbed Cale by the collar, lifting him half off his feet despite the boy's height and the sheriff's age. His breath smelled like tobacco and coffee and fury. "You saved Apache? You helped the enemy?" Cale couldn't answer. His throat had closed around words that wouldn't have helped anyway. What could he say? That they looked like people? That he couldn't watch anyone fall without trying to catch them? that he'd been falling his entire life, and nobody had ever broken his descent. Those weren't reasons Dust Creek would understand. Wesley pushed forward, his voice high with vindictive pleasure. I knew he was trash. I knew he'd betray us. Probably spying for them. Probably telling them where our traps are, where our hunting parties go. The accusations flew like arrows, each one finding a target in Cale's reputation that had never been solid enough to withstand assault. Gideon Rourke spat at Cale's feet. I took you in, gave you food and shelter, and this is how you repay me? By helping savages? The hypocrisy of calling his brutal treatment food and shelter would have been funny if Cale weren't currently staring at a future that looked very much like a rope and a tree. The Apache chief spoke again, and Thomas Bridger translated, though his voice now carried a note of disbelief. He says the boy showed mercy where he could have shown cruelty. He says his daughters spoke of the boy's bleeding hands, his small body trying to do what grown men could not. He says such courage deserves courage in return. The chief dismounted, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his age, and began walking toward the town. The warriors behind him didn't move, but every gun in Dust Creek tracked the chief's progress, like sunflowers following light. Sheriff Dalton dropped Cale and stepped forward, his hand still on his pistol. That's close enough, Chief. State your business and get back to your territory. This is our town, our land, and our business what we do with traders. The word traitor hung in the air like smoke. Kyle felt it wrap around his throat tighter than Gideon's belt had ever managed. His future was narrowing to a single point, and that point looked very much like the end of everything. The chief stopped maybe 20 feet from the front line of armed settlers, close enough to see individual faces, close enough to be killed easily if someone's trigger finger got nervous. He looked past the sheriff, past the guns, directly at Kyle. When he spoke, Thomas translated, but Kyle felt like he understood the words before they were rendered into English, like they were being written directly onto his bones. You pulled my daughters from the white man's trap. You bled for strangers. You gave mercy where you had no reason to give anything. The chief reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something that caught the sunlight like captured fire, a necklace made of turquoise and silver, intricate beyond anything Cale had ever seen, clearly valuable, clearly important. Among my people, a debt like this is not paid with words. It is paid with action, with binding, with blood if necessary. Cale's legs felt like water. This was it. They were going to take him, and Dust Creek would let them because he'd become expendable the moment that finger pointed. But the chief's next words, translated by Thomas in a voice that shook with something between awe and horror, changed everything. I offer this boy a place among my people, not as prisoner, not as slave, as kin. He saved my daughters, the last daughters of my line, the final carriers of my wife's name, who died bringing them into this world. He did what our enemies would never do. He saw humans where others see targets. The chief held out the necklace, an offering and a declaration. If he accepts, he becomes Apache, protected by our warriors, bound by our laws, free from your hatred. The silence that followed was the kind that happens before mountains fall. Kyle stood at the center of an impossible choice, pulled between two worlds that both wanted him for different reasons, neither of them quite seeing him as human, just as a symbol, a tool, a problem to be solved. Behind him, Dust Creek seethed with betrayal and rage. Before him, the Apache offered escape, but at a cost he couldn't fully calculate. And somewhere in the middle, buried under fear and pain and exhaustion, a small voice whispered, "What do you want, Cale? Not what will keep you safest, not what will hurt least, but what do you actually want?" He looked at his wrapped hands, at the blood seeping through the cloth, and realized he'd already made his choice the moment he grabbed that rope. Everything since then was just the world catching up to consequences he'd already set in motion. The only question now was whether he'd own it or run from it, whether he'd be saved or choose to save himself. Cale's voice came out smaller than he wanted, cracked and uncertain, the voice of a boy who'd been beaten down so long he'd forgotten how to stand straight. "What happens to me if I stay here?" He directed the question at Sheriff Dalton, though he already knew the answer in his bones. The sheriff's face was stone, his voice flat as winter wind. "You helped the enemy. That's treason in wartime. Best case, you spend the next 5 years in territorial prison. Worst case, well, he gestured vaguely toward the hanging tree that stood at the edge of town, its branches worn smooth by rope and justice that rarely bothered with trials. Wesley Finch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Worst case, we skip the trial and save everyone some time. Several men in the crowd nodded agreement, their faces showing the kind of eagerness that comes when violence gets permission to dress up as righteousness. Kyle looked at their faces, men who'd watched him grow up, women who'd known his mother, children he'd once played with before poverty made him invisible. Not one showed mercy, not one suggested patience or questions or even basic curiosity about why a 12-year-old boy might pull two people from death. The chief's voice cut through again, and Thomas translated, though the old trapper's expression suggested he was adding his own editorial commentary to the words. Among my people, mercy is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. A warrior who saves an enemy's life proves they fight from choice, not fear. This boy has more warrior spirit than your whole town combined. The insult landed like a physical blow. Kyle watched fury ripple through the crowd, hands tightening on weapons, men taking half steps forward before catching themselves. They wanted blood now. Apache blood, Kyle's blood, didn't much matter which as long as something bled to restore their injured pride. Gideon Rourke pushed to the front, his thick finger jabbing toward Cale like a weapon. This boy is my responsibility. I took him in when nobody else would. I fed him, gave him work, kept him from dying in the street. He owes me. He doesn't get to just run off with savages because he's too coward to face what he did. The lies were so enormous, so grotesque in their reversal of reality, that Cale actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made several people flinch. You beat me, Kyle heard himself say, and his voice was stronger now, fed by something hot and molten rising from his center. Every day, for sport, for nothing. You fed me scraps dogs wouldn't eat, you made me sleep in horse shit, you called it charity, called it kindness, and the whole town pretended that was mercy, because it was easier than helping an orphan whose parents died, making you all rich. The words poured out like water from a broken dam, months and years of swallowed rage finally finding voice. My father died saving men who won't even look at me now. My mother worked herself into the grave washing your clothes. And when I was alone, when I needed help, every single one of you turned away. So don't you dare talk to me about debt, about loyalty, about what I owe this town. He was shaking now, his small body vibrating with emotion too large for his frame. I owe Dust Creek nothing, less than nothing. Dust Creek owes me. The crowd recoiled like he'd struck them, but Kyle wasn't finished. Those women in that canyon, they were about to die in a trap meant for animals, and I pulled them up because that's what humans do. And if that makes me a traitor, then I'm a traitor to something that wasn't worth being loyal to in the first place. Silence fell like snow, cold and complete. Then Wesley Finch moved, fast as a snake, his hand grabbing for Cale's arm. But before he could connect, something whistled through the air and an arrow buried itself in the dirt 6 inches in front of Wesley's expensive boots. Everyone froze. The chief hadn't moved, but one of the warriors behind him, a woman, Kyle realized, one of the sisters he'd saved, had her bow drawn, another arrow already nocked, her face showing exactly zero doubt about her willingness to put that next arrow through Wesley's eye if he took another step. The chief spoke again, his voice carrying that quality of absolute certainty that comes from leading people through decades of survival against impossible odds. The boy speaks truth your town refuses to hear. He is free to choose. Your laws end where your mercy ended. If he comes with us, he walks under our protection. If any of you follow, if any of you touch him, you make war, not with a boy, but with the Apache nation. Thomas translated, then added his own words, speaking directly to Sheriff Dalton. I've known this tribe for 40 years, Sheriff. You don't want this war, you can't win this war, and losing it means this town stops existing. The math of violence played out across the sheriff's face. How many guns they had, how many warriors waited in the rocks beyond what they could see, how fast a peaceful settlement could become a burning memory. His hand lifted slowly from his pistol, and Cale watched the fight drain from the crowd like water from a broken vessel. They would let him go because the cost of keeping him was too high, not because it was right, not because he deserved freedom, but because economics of survival demanded it. The chief approached Cale directly now, close enough to touch, and placed the turquoise necklace over Cale's head. It was heavy, heavier than jewelry should be, weighted with meaning Cale was only beginning to understand. "You are Cale Webb no longer," the chief said in English that was accented but perfectly clear, suggesting he'd understood every word of every conversation and simply chose to speak through Thomas to control the narrative. "You are Cale of the Apache, son of no father, brother to warriors. You will learn our ways, speak our language, hunt with our hunters, sit at our fires, and if the day comes when you wish to leave, you will leave with honor, not chains. That is the Apache way. That is the debt we repay." Cale looked back one last time at Dust Creek, at the faces that had taught him invisibility, at the town that had measured his worth in pennies and found him lacking. Then he turned his back on everything he'd been and walked toward everything he might become, each step feeling like flying and falling all at once, terrifying and necessary, the only choice that was actually his to make. Behind him, the town watched in silence. Ahead, 20 warriors waited to take him home. The Apache camp sat in a canyon that seemed designed by gods who valued defensibility over comfort. Rock walls rose on three sides, creating a natural fortress that funneled wind and echoed sound in ways that made approach by enemies nearly impossible without detection. Water trickled from a spring that pooled in hollowed stone before disappearing underground, and the smell of cooking fires mixed with sage smoke and leather and something indefinably other, the scent of people who lived by different rules than Dust Creek ever imagined. Kyle walked into this strange world with the turquoise necklace heavy around his neck and fear sitting like a stone in his stomach. Children stopped their playing to stare at him. Women looked up from their work with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. Warriors watched him with the kind of assessment that precedes either acceptance or violence, and Cale couldn't tell which way the scales were tipping. The chief led him to the center of the camp, where a large lodge stood, its hide covering painted with symbols that told stories Cale couldn't read yet, each image a chapter in a history stretching back further than Dust Creek had existed, further than Arizona had been a territory, into time that measured itself by generations rather than years. Inside the lodge, it was cooler, dim, the air thick with smoke from a central fire that vented through a hole in the roof. Sitting beside that fire were the two women Kyle had saved, and seeing them here, in their own space rather than hanging above rocks, made him realize just how formidable they actually were. The older sister, Nahimana, he'd learned, was even more impressive in the firelight, her scarred face speaking of battles survived, her posture radiating the kind of authority that comes from being tested and refusing to break. The younger sister, Tyanita, had eyes that burned with an intensity that made Kyle want to look away, but also made looking away impossible. She was beautiful in the way thunderstorms are beautiful, dangerous, untamed, powerful in ways that went beyond physical strength. The chief gestured for Cale to sit, and when he did, the sisters moved closer, studying him like a puzzle whose solution would determine something important. Nahimana spoke first, her English better than her father's, flowing with the rhythm of someone who'd learned by listening rather than reading. "You are small for a lifesaver. I thought perhaps in daylight you would be larger, older, stronger, but you are a child." It wasn't an insult, just an observation, but it stung anyway because Kyle had spent his entire life being reminded of his inadequacy. Tyanita laughed, a sharp sound like a hawk's cry. "Small or not, he pulled us from the pit. Most men would have watched us fall and called it justice. This child did what warriors twice his size would lack courage to attempt." She reached out and grabbed Kyle's hands, unwrapping the cloth to reveal the rope burns that were starting to scab, angry red marks that would scar. "These are warrior marks, earned through choice, not chance. They honor you." She pressed her thumb into one of the wounds, not cruelly but testing, and Cale gritted his teeth against crying out. When she released him, there was something like respect in her eyes. The chief, who'd introduced himself as Chayton, which Thomas had translated as Falcon, settled across the fire from Kyle and began to speak in a voice that suggested this conversation would determine everything that followed. You chose to walk away from your people? That is brave. But bravery without understanding is just foolishness, wearing courage's face. Do you know what you've chosen? Do you understand what being Apache means? Cale shook his head, honesty feeling like the only currency he had left. No, sir, I just knew staying in Dust Creek meant dying slow or dying fast, and both seemed like waste. Chayton nodded slowly, something like approval flickering across his stoic features. Honesty, that is rare enough to be valuable. Very well, I will tell you what you have chosen, and then you will decide if you wish to continue or return to your people and face whatever awaits you there. He leaned forward, and the firelight carved his face into something ancient and terrible. We are Apache. We do not own land. We are part of it. We do not take more than we need, and we share what we have with those who share our struggle. We raise warriors, not conquerors. We value cunning over cruelty, endurance over brute strength, the ability to survive where others die. We have been hunted by Spanish, by Mexicans, by your people, the Americans, for generations. We have lost more than you can imagine: land, children, futures, dreams. What remains of us remains because we refuse to stop being who we are. His voice grew harder, colder. But make no mistake, boy, we are not saints. We raid, we fight, we kill when survival demands it. We have struck at Dust Creek because Dust Creek struck at us first, though they tell themselves a different story. If you stay, you will become part of that cycle. You will learn to fight. You will learn to hate our enemies, even if some of those enemies were once your neighbors. The weight of those words settled on Kyle like a physical thing, pressing down on his shoulders until he felt smaller than he'd ever been. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't salvation. This was a door opening onto a path that led somewhere dark and difficult, a place where the boy he'd been might not survive, where comfort and safety weren't promises but distant possibilities earned through blood and endurance. He thought about his mother's gentle hands, his father's patient teaching, the version of himself that had existed before the mine collapse stole his future. That boy was already dead, killed by Dust Creek's indifference as surely as dynamite had killed Marcus Webb. What sat here now in this Apache lodge was something new, unformed, raw as an open wound, but alive, still breathing, still capable of becoming whatever came next. Cale met Chayton's eyes and spoke words that felt like stepping off a cliff, with no idea where the ground waited. I choose this. I choose you. Not because it's safe or easy, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone's asking me what I want instead of telling me what I'm worth. Teach me. I'll learn. I'll work. I'll become whatever I need to become to earn this chance. Chayton studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. Then we begin. Tonight you sleep here in this lodge under our protection. Tomorrow your real education starts. And Cale, he paused, making sure the boy was listening with every fiber of his being. What you are ends here. What you become starts now. There is no going back. The next 6 months dissolved Cale's old life like salt in water until he could barely remember being the boy who'd slept in stables and flinched from raised hands. The Apache didn't coddle him, didn't treat him like a child who needed protecting, and that absence of pity became the first real gift anyone had given him in years. Nahimana took charge of his physical training with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for a project this challenging. She woke him before dawn every morning by dumping cold water on his face, then dragged him into the desert for runs that started at 2 miles and grew longer each week until Cale could cover 10 miles over broken terrain without stopping. His body, which had been wire-thin from malnutrition and overwork, began to change, muscles growing in places he didn't know muscles existed, his lungs expanding to pull oxygen from air so dry it felt like breathing fire. his feet developing calluses thick enough that he could run barefoot over rocks that would have crippled him months before. Nahimana was merciless, pushing him past the point where he wanted to quit, then pushing harder still. But she was also fair, acknowledging improvement with small nods that felt more valuable than any praise Cale had received in Dust Creek. Tyanita taught him to fight, and where her sister was methodical, Tyanita was chaos incarnate, attacking him without warning, testing his reflexes, his ability to read an opponent's body language, his willingness to continue when every instinct screamed retreat. She gave him a knife, not a fancy thing, just a simple blade with a worn handle, and taught him how to hold it, how to move with it, how to think of it as an extension of his arm rather than a tool. She drilled him on pressure points, vulnerable areas, the difference between fighting to wound and fighting to kill. And she never softened the lessons with comfort or reassurance. When Kyle failed, she told him he'd be dead. When he succeeded, she told him he'd live to fight again. It was brutal, exhausting education, but it was honest in ways nothing in his previous life had been. There were no lies here, no pretending that the world was gentle or that survival came to those who simply wished for it. The Apache taught him that life was a fight, and the only question was whether you fought smart or stupid, prepared or panicked, with honor or with desperation. Kyle chose smart, prepared, and honorable, and slowly, painfully, impossibly, he began to transform. Language came harder than physical skills. Each Apache word a puzzle his English-trained tongue struggled to solve. Chayton would sit with him in the evenings, pointing to objects and speaking their names, in a language that seemed to flow like water over stones, musical and complex, full of sounds Kyle's mouth had never made before. Cup became two, horse became we, sky became ya. Kyle repeated them until his throat hurt, mispronouncing everything until the children laughed and the elders shook their heads, but Chayton never showed frustration, just patient persistence that suggested he understood language was a bridge, and bridges took time to build. Slowly, painfully, Kyle began to understand conversations happening around him, began to respond in halting, childlike Apache that probably sounded ridiculous, but earned him nods of encouragement from people who'd started treating him less like an outsider and more like a strange plant that might, against all odds, actually grow in this harsh soil. The stories were what truly began to change him, though, the stories the elders told around fires at night, tales of creation and trickery, of heroes and fools, of the world when it was young and the lessons it taught those brave enough or stupid enough to listen. One story in particular stuck with Cale like a burr in wool told by an ancient woman named Hosea, whose face looked like a map of every hard year the Apache had survived. She spoke of a coyote who'd found a wounded eagle and could have killed it easily, could have fed itself and its children on eagle meat for days, but the coyote had pulled thorns from the eagle's wing instead, had protected it from other predators while it healed, and when the eagle finally flew again, it had carried the coyote's children to safety during a fire that would have killed them. The lesson, Hosea said, her clouded eyes somehow seeing right through Cale to whatever was growing in his chest, is that mercy creates bonds stronger than blood. You saved my great-granddaughters, not knowing they were chief's daughters, not knowing there would be reward, just knowing they were living things in danger. That is eagle medicine, the ability to see from high enough that all living things matter, not just those who look like you or speak your language. You are young, small, white, born to our enemies, but you have eagle medicine, boy, and that is rarer than gold, more valuable than all the horses in all the territories. Kyle felt tears burn his eyes, and for once he didn't try to hide them, because here, in this place, emotion wasn't weakness. It was proof you were still capable of feeling something besides fear. The first time Cale brought down a deer with the bow Tyanita had been teaching him to use, the whole camp celebrated like he'd won a war. They roasted the meat and shared it. everyone eating together, and when Nahimana stood and announced in Apache that Kyle had provided for the tribe that he'd hunted with skill and patience, the warriors raised their voices in a cry that echoed off the canyon walls and made Kyle's chest swell with something he'd almost forgotten existed: pride, real and earned, not the false pride of putting others down, but the solid pride of achieving something difficult through effort and growth. That night, lying on furs in Chayton's lodge, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep, Cale realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about Dust Creek, couldn't remember the faces that had once filled his nightmares with their cruelty and indifference. They were fading like old photographs, becoming memories rather than wounds, and in their place was something new, a sense of belonging that didn't require him to be invisible, a family that didn't require him to be anything other than willing to learn and grow and contribute. For the first time since his mother died, Kyle fell asleep feeling like tomorrow might be worth waking up for, like the future was something to build toward rather than something to survive. The boy who'd grabbed that rope was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone capable, someone the Apache called by a new name, Shyla, which meant brother. And Shyla, unlike Cale, knew he wasn't alone anymore. Winter came to the Arizona territory like a knife through thin cloth, sharp and unexpected, turning the desert into something that could kill the unprepared in a single freezing night. Kyle Shyla, now to everyone in camp, had survived his first season with the Apache, had earned his place through sweat and blood and stubborn refusal to quit, and now the tribe was preparing for the lean months when game grew scarce and every stored resource meant the difference between survival and starvation. He'd learned to track in snow, to find water in frozen ground, to read the sky for storms that could bury the canyon in white silence. He'd also learned the darker lessons: how to move silently through settler territory, how to raid supply wagons without killing if possible, but with lethal efficiency if necessary, how to be invisible when being seen meant death. The Apache were fighting a war of survival against forces that wanted them erased from existence, and Shyla was becoming a soldier in that war whether he'd intended to or not. It was during one of these winter raids that everything Shyla had been building collided with everything Cale had been running from, and the impact nearly destroyed him. They'd been moving through the foothills near Dust Creek, a hunting party of 8 warriors plus Shyla, looking for elk that sometimes sheltered in the pine groves when the higher elevations became too brutal. Tayanita led the group, her movements fluid and confident, reading tracks in the snow like some people read newspapers, seeing stories written in hoofprints and scat that told her exactly where the herd had gone and when. Shyla followed, trying to match her silence, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air, his fingers numb despite the gloves Nahimana had made him from deer hide, lined with rabbit fur. They'd found the elk and were moving into position when Tayanita's hand shot up in the stop signal, her body going absolutely still in that way that meant danger, immediate and close. Shyla froze, every sense straining, and then he heard it. Voices speaking English coming from the direction they'd been about to approach. Tayanita gestured for everyone to drop low, and they melted into the snow-covered rocks like they'd never been there at all. Shyla crawled forward until he could see through a gap in the stones, and his heart stopped. 3 men from Dust Creek stood in a clearing below, and Shyla recognized every one of them. Wesley Finch, older now, but still carrying that air of entitled cruelty that came from never facing real consequences. Deputy Porter, the sheriff's nephew, always quick with fists when dealing with anyone poor or different. And Thomas Bridger, the old trapper, who'd translated during that confrontation 6 months ago, though his presence here felt wrong somehow, disconnected from the casual cruelty radiating from the other 2. They were setting traps, not hunting traps, but something worse, something that made Shyla's stomach turn. Wire snares positioned at human height, disguised to look like game trails, designed to catch people rather than animals. Wesley was laughing, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Indians are too stupid to see these coming. We catch a few, bring them back to town, make examples. Maybe that treaty-loving chief will think twice before raiding our supply lines. Deputy Porter grinned, checking the tension on a snare that could decapitate someone moving at speed. We should have done this months ago. Let them learn what happens when they harbor traitors. The word traitors hit Schuyler like a physical blow because he knew they meant him, knew that 6 months hadn't made Dust Creek forget or forgive. Thomas Bridger stood apart from the other two, his face troubled, his hands not touching the traps. This isn't right, Wesley. These snares don't discriminate. Could catch a child, could catch someone just passing through. This is murder, not defense. Wesley's laugh was ugly, full of contempt. You getting soft in your old age, Bridger? They're Apache. They're not people. They're problems, and problems get solved. He finished setting a trap, tested it, smiled at how quickly it would close. Besides, that little bastard Cale chose them over us, makes every single one of them complicit. We're just returning the favor. Schuyler felt Tyanita's hand on his shoulder, pressing down, a command to stay still, stay silent, stay hidden. But rage was building in his chest like a storm, hot and terrible, because these were the people he'd grown up with, people who'd known his parents, people who went to church every Sunday and sang hymns about mercy and redemption, and here they were setting death traps for human beings like it was sport. The gap between who Dust Creek claimed to be and who they actually were had never been wider or more grotesque, and Schuyler felt the last threads connecting him to his old life snap like rotten rope. Tyanita pulled him back, her eyes hard as flint, and when they'd retreated far enough to speak without being heard, she leaned close and whispered in Apache, "You know these men. You have history with them. What should we do?" It was the first time any of the warriors had asked Schuyler's opinion on something this important, the first time they'd treated him as a full member of the war party rather than a student tagging along. He looked at the faces around him, Tyanita, stern and fierce, Nahimana, calculating and patient, 4 other warriors whose names he knew, whose families he'd eaten with, whose children called him uncle. These were his people now, whatever Dust Creek had been to him once. These traps proved that bridge was burned beyond repair. Schuyler made his decision in heartbeats, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, cold, belonging to someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required hard choices. We disable the traps, all of them. We leave marks, Apache marks, so they know we found them, so they know we're not the stupid savages they think we are. And we leave a message for Thomas Bridger because he's the only one of them with a conscience left. We tell him that mercy works both ways, that we could have killed them but chose not to, just like I chose to pull Nahimana and Tyanita from that ravine. We show them that we're better than they are, and we make them live with that knowledge. Tyanita smiled, fierce and proud. Good answer, little brother. Now let's go be ghosts that these white men never forget. They moved like smoke through snow, dismantling every trap, leaving clear Apache symbols carved into trees where the men couldn't miss them. And when they were finished, they disappeared into the winter landscape like they'd never existed at all, leaving Dust Creek's hunters to wonder how their perfect ambush had been discovered and why they were still breathing when by all rights they should be dead. Spring came late that year, the snow refusing to melt even as March gave way to April, and with the delayed thaw came a desperation that made even careful people reckless. The Apache supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, game remaining scarce, the stored food from autumn running out. Faster than anyone had planned, Chayton called a council, and for the first time, Schuyler was invited to sit with the warriors rather than wait outside with the children. The conversation was tense, urgent, conducted in rapid Apache that Schuyler now understood well enough to follow. The tribe needed food, needed supplies, and the nearest source was Dust Creek's warehouse, a fortified building where the town stored grain and preserved goods against their own lean times. Raiding it would be dangerous, would likely end the fragile non-aggression that had existed since Schuyler's adoption, but the alternative was watching children starve. Tyanita spoke passionately for the raid, her voice like sharpened steel. They have excess, we have need. That is the calculation. They would let us die without losing sleep. Why should we extend them courtesies? They refuse us. Nahimana was more cautious, arguing for a smaller target, but Chaitan's face was grave as stone. If we raid, we commit fully. Half measures get people killed. His eyes found Shyla across the fire. You know this place. You know its rhythms, its weak points, its patterns. You know when guards change, when people sleep, where they store keys and weapons. This raid succeeds or fails based on intelligence you possess. The weight of every gaze settled on Shyla like snow on branches, heavy enough to break him if he wasn't careful. They were asking him to betray Dust Creek completely, not just philosophically, but tactically, to use knowledge gained as one of their children to hurt them as an Apache warrior. It should have been a hard decision. It should have torn him apart. But as Shyla sat there, looking at faces he'd come to love, at children who called him uncle, and warriors who called him brother, he realized there was no decision to make. Dust Creek had rejected him when he was vulnerable, had been willing to hang him for showing mercy, had set death traps meant to kill the people who'd taken him in. Whatever debt he'd owed to his birthplace had been paid in blood and loneliness long before he'd grabbed that rope. I'll help plan the raid, Shyla said quietly, and felt the last ghost of Cale Webb whisper goodbye and fade into nothing. They spent 3 days planning, mapping, preparing for every contingency. The raid would happen on Saturday night when half the town would be drunk at the saloon and the other half would be sleeping off exhaustion from the week's work. 12 warriors would go, moving fast and silent, in and out before Dust Creek could organize a response. Shyla would lead them to the warehouse, show them the weak point in the back wall where wood had rotted and been patched poorly, get them inside, and then they'd take what they needed, nothing more, nothing less, just enough food to keep the tribe fed until the hunting improved. No killing unless absolutely necessary, no burning or destruction beyond what was required to complete the mission. It was a clean plan, a smart plan, and it should have worked perfectly. But what actually happened that Saturday night became the story that would echo through both Apache campfires and Dust Creek saloons for generations, growing in the telling until truth and legend became impossible to separate. The raid started exactly as planned, 12 shadows moving through Dust Creek's sleeping streets, so silent that dogs barely stirred. Shyla led them to the warehouse, showed them the rotted section of wall, and watched as Tyanita and 2 others pried boards loose with practiced efficiency. They slipped inside, and for 10 perfect minutes, everything went according to plan. Bags of grain, preserved meat, dried beans. They worked in silence, taking what they needed, moving like parts of a single organism. Then came the sound that shattered everything, a child's cry, high and terrified, coming from the corner of the warehouse where shadows pooled deepest. Shyla's blood turned to ice water. There shouldn't be children here. The warehouse was locked at night, guarded, completely off limits. But when Tyanita raised her torch, the light revealed a small girl, maybe 6 years old, huddled behind crates with tear-stained cheeks and eyes wide with terror. She wore a thin nightgown despite the cold, her feet bare, her skin showing signs of abuse that Shyla recognized because he'd worn similar marks often enough. Someone had locked her in here, had hidden her in this freezing warehouse as punishment for some perceived wrong, and now she was staring at Apache warriors like they were the monsters her parents had probably told her would eat misbehaving children. Nahimana moved forward slowly, hands visible and empty, speaking in soft Apache that the girl couldn't understand, but might recognize as non-threatening. But before she could get close, the warehouse door exploded inward. Sheriff Dalton stood framed in moonlight with a rifle leveled and murder in his eyes, and behind him were at least 20 armed men, far too many for this to be coincidence or luck. They'd been waiting. This was a trap, and Shyla had led his family directly into it. "Nobody move!" Dalton's voice cracked like a whip. "You're surrounded, outgunned, and about to face justice for every crime you've committed against this town." The little girl started crying harder, and Wesley Finch pushed past the sheriff, his face twisted with triumph. "Told you the traitor would bring them. Told you we just needed bait they couldn't resist." He gestured at the child. "Little Mary's been crying in here for 2 hours, but it was worth it to catch these savages and their pet." The casual cruelty of using a child as bait, of leaving her freezing and terrified to spring a trap, hit Shyla like a physical blow. These were the people he'd been born among, the society that claimed civilization and Christianity and moral authority, and they'd just weaponized a child's suffering to catch their enemies. Whatever ambiguity Shyla had been, carrying whatever small voice wondered if maybe both sides were equally wrong, died in that moment. The Apache had never done anything half as monstrous as what Dust Creek just did, and suddenly Shyla knew exactly whose side he was on, exactly what he was willing to do to protect his family. Tyanita met his eyes across the warehouse, and something passed between them, an understanding that required no words. They were going to have to fight their way out, and not all of them were going to make it home. Time moved like honey, thick and slow, every second stretching into lifetimes as Shyla calculated angles and outcomes, his mind racing through possibilities faster than his heart could beat. 20 armed men against 12 warriors in an enclosed space meant death, meant slaughter, meant the end of everyone Shyla had come to love. Unless, the word hung in his mind like a fishhook, sharp and promising, unless he could change the equation, unless he could give the warriors time to escape, unless he was willing to pay a price he'd been avoiding thinking about since the moment Chayton had placed that turquoise necklace around his neck 6 months ago. Shyla stepped forward, hands raised, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife through cloth. Let them go. This was my idea. I told them about the warehouse, about the food, about the weak wall. They followed my plan. If you want justice, take me. The lie flowed smooth and complete, wrapping around the truth just enough to be believable, and he watched Sheriff Dalton's face flicker with uncertainty. Wesley Finch laughed, shrill and ugly. The traitor wants to play hero. How touching. But we're taking all of you, putting you on trial, making examples that'll keep the Apache from ever... He never finished. Nahimana moved like lightning, her body a blur as she grabbed the little girl and rolled behind the crates, shielding the child with her massive frame. Simultaneously, Tyanita threw her torch into the hay stacked against the far wall, and flames erupted with hungry enthusiasm. Chaos exploded in all directions, men shouting, guns firing, warriors scattering into pre-planned escape patterns. They'd drilled 100 times. Shyla felt more than saw a bullet pass close enough to hear it whisper secrets about death in his ear. He ran not toward the door where Dust Creek's men blocked escape, but toward the burning wall, toward the flames that were already consuming the dried wood with terrifying speed. He heard Tyanita screaming his name in Apache, heard Chayton's voice commanding warriors to retreat, heard the little girl crying, and underneath it all, he heard his mother's voice from a memory so old it felt like a dream, telling him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right, even when it cost everything. Shyla grabbed a barrel and hurled it through the burning wall, creating a gap that fire was already widening into an escape route. "Go!" he screamed in Apache. "All of you go now. I'll hold them here." He turned to face Dust Creek's men with empty hands, and a plan forming in his mind like ice crystals, beautiful and fragile and probably suicidal. Sheriff Dalton was trying to organize his men, half of them fighting the fire, half trying to shoot warriors who were disappearing into smoke and shadow with the efficiency of people who'd been vanishing from superior forces for generations. The little girl was still screaming, but Nahimana had her, was carrying her toward the gap in the wall, despite bullets thudding into wood around them. Shyla saw Wesley Finch raise his rifle, saw him aim at Nahimana's broad back, saw him squeeze the trigger, and moved before thought could stop him. He crashed into Wesley from the side, taking them both to the ground, feeling the rifle discharge harmlessly into the ceiling as they fell. They hit hard, all elbows and knees and desperation, and Wesley's fist connected with Shyla's jaw, with enough force to make stars explode behind his eyes. But Shyla had been trained by Tyanita, had learned to fight not with strength, but with leverage and speed, and the willingness to do whatever survival required. He got his legs around Wesley's torso, twisted, used his whole body weight to slam the bigger boy's head into the floor, once, twice, until Wesley went limp. Then Shyla was running again, diving through the smoke toward where he'd last seen Nahimana. He found her at the gap, the little girl clutched to her chest, and for one perfect moment their eyes met. Nahimana's face showed something Shyla had never seen there before. Fear, not for herself, but for him, the little brother who'd chosen to stay behind while his family escaped. "Shyla, no, come with us!" But Shyla shook his head, pushing her through the gap, even as flames licked at his clothes, even as the warehouse groaned with the sound of a structure deciding to stop being a building and become a pyre. "Get her safe. Get everyone safe. Tell Chaitin I'm sorry I couldn't hunt one more season with him. Tell Tyanita she made me a warrior." He smiled then, small and sad, and absolutely certain. "Tell everyone I chose this. Tell them I chose you." Then he turned back to face the fire and the men and the judgment he'd been running from since he grabbed that rope. And for the first time in his entire life, Shyla felt completely, utterly free. The warehouse was an inferno now, flames consuming everything, smoke so thick he could barely breathe. He could hear men coughing, scrambling for exits, abandoning their hunt for Apache in favor of saving their own lives. But through the smoke, Shyla saw one figure still standing, still searching, still refusing to give up. Sheriff Dalton, his face blackened with soot, his eyes streaming tears from smoke, spotted Shyla and started toward him with grim determination. They met in the center of the burning building, surrounded by flames that cared nothing for justice or revenge or the complicated histories that had led two people to this moment. Dalton grabbed Shyla's shirt, and for a second the boy thought this was the end, thought the sheriff would hold him here until the fire took them both. But then Dalton did something completely unexpected. He pulled Shyla close and spoke directly into his ear, his voice rough from smoke and something that might have been regret. "Your father saved my brother in that mine collapse. Did you know that?" He pushed him toward the air pocket, used his own body to shield him from falling rock. "My brother lived, Marcus died. I've owed your family a debt for 3 years, and I've done nothing but fail to collect on it." He shoved Shyla toward the door, toward life, toward a future that suddenly seemed possible again. "Run, boy, run and don't come back. This town doesn't deserve you, never did, but maybe those Apache do. Tell them," he coughed, bent double from smoke inhalation. "Tell them Sheriff Dalton said the debt is paid." Then he pushed Shyla one final time, sending him stumbling out into the cool night air, while behind them the warehouse collapsed inward with a roar like thunder, taking with it the last physical connection between Cale Webb and the life he'd been born into. Shyla ran. He ran through streets he'd grown up on, past buildings he'd cleaned and swept and served, past people who'd never seen him as anything more than convenient labor or convenient scapegoat. He ran until Dust Creek was behind him, until the desert opened up ahead like an invitation, until he saw figures waiting in the pre-dawn light, warriors mounted on horses, and there in front, Tyanita and Nahimana with a horse for him, with relief and fury and love written across their faces in equal measure. Chaitin rode forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute acceptance. "You chose family over safety. You chose honor over survival. You are Apache in ways blood could never make you, Shyla. Welcome home." And as the sun rose over the canyon that had become his sanctuary, Shyla, no longer Cale, no longer the poor boy from Dust Creek, but someone new, someone earned through pain and choice and the willingness to pull strangers from falling, rode home with his family, knowing that some decisions cost everything and give back even more, knowing that mercy is the strongest magic any human possesses, knowing that he'd finally found the place where he belonged, not because it was perfect, but because it was his, chosen with open eyes and bleeding hands, and a heart that refused to stop believing people were worth saving, even when the world suggested otherwise. The story would spread through both communities, growing in the telling, becoming legend, the poor white boy who saved 2 Apache giants and became a warrior, the raid that ended with a sheriff paying an old debt, the fire that burned away hatred and left something like understanding in its ashes. But for Shyla, riding through the morning light with his sisters laughing beside him and his father waiting ahead, the only truth that mattered was simple. He'd found his people, and they'd found him. And sometimes that's all the happy ending anyone needs.